We lost our sovereignty through the Closer Economic Relations, the CER, and they merged the regulatory authorities and the food standards, Australia and New Zealand. Every Australian state and capital territory gets one vote, and New Zealand gets one. It's not like one vote, one country with the United Nations. So we basically had to go along with the Australian pro-irradiation, and in the process they have approved the irradiation of a whole range of important fruit and vegetables in our diet. They started off with mangoes, which was sort of regarded as a sweetener because they're not a major component, and Australian mangoes are nice, but I won't eat the ones here because they're irradiated.
That's right.
Since then, the regulatory body has approved the irradiation of tomatoes, capsicums, grapes, pepperfruit, citrus fruit. There's a whole lot of it, and it's meant to be labelled so that the consumer has a choice. But what we're finding is that there are times when retailers recognise that consumers will back off if they clearly see that it's irradiated. So they're either putting labels on that are impossible to read without a magnifying glass, or in one instance that we monitored, a food chain was selling Australian irradiated tomatoes labelled as New Zealand tomato. There's even a disturbing belief among a lot of, well, I wouldn't say a majority, but a lot of young people that nuclear power is clean and green, and we have to dispel that myth completely.
Hi, this is Bruce Lipton, and you're listening to Green Planet FM.
Kia ora, greetings, and welcome to Green Planet FM 104.6. I'm Tim Lynch, and I trust that you are doing well. I invite you to stay with me over the next hour as we discuss and find ways to take care of our unique and magnificent green planet Earth. If the Earth were only a few meters in diameter, floating just above a clearing or in a field somewhere, people would come from everywhere to marvel at it. People would walk around it, marveling at the large pools of water, its little pools, and the water flowing between these pools. People would admire at the contours on it and the colours of it, and they would be awed at the very thin layers of gas. The people would marvel at all the creatures moving around the surface of the ball and the water. The people would declare it precious because it was the only one, and they would protect it so that it would not be hurt. The ball would be the greatest wonder known, and people would come to behold it, to be healed, to gain knowledge, to know beauty, and to wonder how it could be. People would love it and defend it with their lives, because they would somehow know that their lives, their own roundness, could be nothing without it. If the Earth were only a few meters in diameter. This was originally written by someone affiliated to Friends of the Earth. In the studio this morning, I have Dennis Trussell and Bob Tait of FO, Friends of the Earth, the New Zealand chapter. And I have originally come across Friends of the Earth way back in 1974. And for a wee while I joined FO here in Auckland, and I met Dennis Trussell, and later on I met Bob too, and I found they've been very consistent. They see what the challenges are in the biosphere, and they have been working diligently to face environmental challenges that are coming at us, but particularly they're factoring in the future of children. So, kia ora, Dennis and Bob.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Tim.
Dennis, seeing I've known you, and there's so much to do for us, would you like to first give a little background on Friends of the Earth, how they came into being, and then you may want to talk with Bob as to what you see as very important issues facing us as a humanity and the biosphere?
We started because of a forestry issue, I suppose. First of all, the people who started Friends of the Earth were involved in the Beach Forest Action Committee, which was campaigning against a massive logging scheme in the South Island of indigenous forest. The Beach Forest Action Committee fell to pieces because of personal conflicts, I suppose. That's the simplest way of putting it. A British ecologist came to New Zealand in 1974 called Graham Sell. He made contact with me, and I took him around the forestry scheme in South Island, and he wrote a book about it. He was a member of Friends of the Earth in London, and Friends of the Earth worldwide was just starting up. And he said, well, the Beach Forest Action Committee has problems, why don't you set up a New Zealand branch of Friends of the Earth? And we did, and it was incorporated, I think, in 1974. I'm not sure if we didn't finally launch in 1975. And the launching issue was also the launching of Graham Sell's book on the South Island beach forests. That's how it all began. Since then, we've been involved in everything from sewage sludge to uranium to energy and transport issues to some social issues. There's no shortage of issues.
I hear you, there isn't. And Bob, when did you come into it?
I came in the mid-'80s, and I was flatting with Dennis at a big old house in Parnell, and I was interested in what I'd read a little bit about food irradiation. And Dennis said, there's a Friends of the Earth meeting coming up. Would you like to come along? And so I went along, and I naively said, well, could you folks look into this? And they said, well, you seem to know a little bit about it. Could you do a bit of background? And before very long, I found myself getting more and more involved and ended up becoming a voluntary researcher and campaigner. And I've continued. I'm still active in that issue today because New Zealand, because of our involvement, we got put onto the Working Party on Irradiation Issues. Ministry for the Environment convened that. And as a result of that working party, New Zealand became the first country in the world to ban the irradiation of food, which was entirely consistent with our anti-nuclear policy.
This was fantastic.
Yeah.
And we are yet over in Australia. They are irradiating a lot of the food coming into New Zealand. Is that correct?
That's been the problem because we lost our sovereignty through the Closer Economic Relations, the CER, and they merged the regulatory authorities and the food standards, Australia and New Zealand. Every Australian state and capital territory gets one vote and New Zealand gets one. It's not like one vote, one country with the United Nations. So we basically had to go along with the Australian pro-irradiation, and in the process they have approved the irradiation of a whole range of important fruit and vegetables in our diet. They started off with mangoes, which was sort of regarded as a sweetener because they're not a major component, and Australian mangoes are nice, but I won't eat the ones here because they're irradiated.
That's right.
Since then, the regulatory body has approved the irradiation of tomatoes, capsicums, grapes, pepperfruit, citrus fruit. There's a whole lot of it, and it's meant to be labelled so that the consumer has a choice. But what we're finding is that there are times when retailers recognise that consumers will back off if they clearly see that it's irradiated. So they're either putting labels on that are impossible to read without a magnifying glass, or in one instance that we monitored, a food chain was selling Australian irradiated tomatoes labelled as New Zealand tomatoes.
Yes, well, this is horrific. This is really dishonest. What can we do about this?
Well, in this instance, we notified we had to get proof, and we got that by... I don't know if I should broadcast this.
No, just say that you got the proof, and that was good enough. Yes.
We got the proof. And we then went to the Tomato Growers Federation of New Zealand, and they took it up with the Ministry of Primary Industries. And it all was, I wouldn't say they were raided, they were visited, and they were told in no uncertain terms that they would be prosecuted if this was repeated. We're still monitoring them, and we think that they've backed off. But I know of other instances where they were selling this, but we weren't able to get inspectors out to prove it.
Was this under the previous national regime?
Both Labor and National.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's now, we're trying to keep a handle on that. And what Friends of the Earth has done more in the past than recently, put out issue papers. And Dennis and I often talk about this because a lot of the younger generation, they weren't alive when those campaigns were on. And there's even a disturbing belief among a lot of, I wouldn't say a majority, but a lot of young people that nuclear power is clean and green, and we have to dispel that myth completely.
I agree. I mean, it doesn't take long to twist our great nuclear-free New Zealand policy, and we need to get refocused on this, and it's a big challenge. Dennis, what about you?
Bob's hit the nail on the head. Most of the issues we're involved with are very long-term issues. Some of them are almost hidden from the public. They're background issues, but they're of critical importance. The first issue we became involved in, the Indigenous forestry one, we and other groups took 30 years to bring the worst aspects of that to a halt. But there are still dangers of that kind of project happening again. There are signs of the re-emergence of the idea that it's legitimate to log indigenous forest that's on public land. But at the moment, that issue is under control. But it took 30 years to get it under control.
And nobody knew that either.
Now, with the nuclear issues, everybody says, well, we've got anti-nuclear legislation, we're safe. The answer is, we're not. There are many minor but significant ways in which that act is being breached. So we find ourselves, after 30, 40, even 50 years doing this kind of work, that we're still having to revisit old issues as well as taking up new ones. And that is, I guess, how it's going to be.
It's tiring. You're doing it all the time, Dennis. I mean, it's 40 plus years that I've known you doing this, and you're just having to do it because there are so few people on the ground volunteering to hold the line. So what do we have to do to get more people involved? And then we can get back into the issues again.
Well, it's a perpetual problem of communication. I'll let Bob talk to you, for instance, about a hidden issue that is still a problem, and that most New Zealanders have not the faintest idea is happening, in the issue of uranium oxide shipments, concentrated uranium oxide shipments.
Yeah, this one here is constantly sliding in underneath the radar. And thank you, Bob.
Yes, we just found out about this because we try and get on as many monitoring lists as we can. And when IRMA was, the Environment Risk Management Authority, was operating, in amongst their announcements was an application for concentrated uranium oxide to come through ports of Auckland. And this was completely unknown to us, so we made inquiries. And it came about because radioactive materials don't directly come under IRMA. They're concerned with toxic or other hazardous materials in other regards. But some sharp person had established that uranium oxide concentrate was toxic in its own right, so they needed to make an application. So we then found that the previous shipments of uranium from Australia was going up north, and they had made a policy change to use standard container routes, and they were all coming to New Zealand. And we were never given a clear explanation for this, but it is believed that it was a decision to try and minimise the risk of hijacking of the ships going through the Malacca Straits, and it was a safer route to bring them through New Zealand.
To where? From where to where?
From all of the Australian producing uranium mines. I think there's 4 of them now. There was 3 earlier on. They all come through New Zealand, mostly through Auckland, but also through Tauranga, and I think it's Lyttelton and maybe Nelson. I'm not sure of the South Island ones. But the one that we got the details on here, and they shut down all the paperwork, they were bringing in 800 tonnes of concentrated uranium, and the workers weren't told at ports of Auckland, and it was completely going under the radar. And we've got no capability here to deal with an accident or a spillage of the material inside the ships. We found out that they store it at the lowest level in the bow, and I asked Ports of Auckland about that because we had meetings with them, and I said, why is that? And they said, of course, it's furthest from the cruise quarters, which has a certain logic to it. But that area of the ship is the one most affected by storms at sea, and we got some photos of containers that had ruptured, not with uranium in them, but other containers, and they look like they've been attacked with a giant can opener. And that's just a storm, that's not a collision, and they often encounter quite severe storms across the Tasman. And we strongly objected to New Zealand being a part of the uranium fuel cycle, and from here it goes eventually to the States where it gets processed and enriched. And they enrich it, they say, to the extent of making fuel pellets out of it, but there's no real monitoring of whether that's going into enrichment as such for weapons production. But the other side of it is that for every 8 tonnes of uranium oxide, you get approximately 1 tonne of enriched pellets, fuel pellets, and the rest is what they call euphemistically depleted uranium. Now, that is used in armour-piercing artillery, and it's used for that purpose because it's incendiary. When it hits the steel at sufficient velocity, it burns, and it burns its way through. But when it burns, it produces a fine dust of uranium, which then it's only depleted because it's had one of the isotopes taken out. It's still radioactive, and it goes on to be radioactive for thousands of years, breaking down into things like radium and polonium that are highly toxic to people in the environment. And you can't clean that stuff up. That's what some of the war regions are suffering now around the world.
After Iraq, after the Allies, the American forces went into Iraq, I hear that their kids were playing around on old tanks, the Iraqi children, and they were breathing this in, and they would have been doing all sorts of things. So in Iraq, it's basically a no-go zone, and Afghanistan's the same, and we've got our SAS who've been up in Afghanistan, so they'll be breathing this all in. So we have a huge problem that has not yet reached the general public. Nikki Hager has done so much, but we need somebody else to really raise this whole issue.
Bob's account is just one of many such stories of what you might call a sleeping dogs issue. The public are unaware of it, even though we had quite good media coverage at the time. The shipments continue as far as we know, and although they don't necessarily land any of the material in New Zealand ports, sometimes they have to when they're rejigging the cargo arrangements. And that, as far as we know, is still the status quo. And when, I think it was you, Bob, who succeeded in getting a question asked by the Greens in Parliament about the situation, and Nick Smith, who was then the Minister of Environment, said, why should we worry about Australian dirt? That was his response. Now, that is extraordinary, because the situation was that even the government genuinely didn't know about the shipments. The only people who knew about the shipments were officials who had to be involved in the IRMA or EPA process and be informed that these shipments were coming through New Zealand ports. So we don't think the government were actually fibbing when they said they didn't know about it. But when they did find out about it, they did nothing about it. Or another sleeping dog issue has been the genetic engineering issue. Now, we had a Royal Commission on Genetic Engineering in 2001, and the same kind of process occurs. Everybody says, we've had a Royal Commission, they made some rules, we put some of those rules in the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, we're safe. Far from true. Legislation was inadequate. The Royal Commission perpetrated many falsehoods, in some cases knowingly, and now we are dealing with a new wave of genetic engineering technology called gene editing, or the making of what are called gene drives, and it has an acronym, an absurd one, CRISPR. It's on the media all the time as being the latest thing since sliced bread. Right now, we're preparing a submission for the Royal Society on this issue. When you mention this to even well-informed and well-meaning New Zealand citizens, they just don't know what you're talking about. And so you have to tell them. And gene editing and gene drives are probably perilous technologies. They may have some uses. In the background of them, the research on them, I should point out, in New Zealand is probably going to be financed by the American military through an organisation called DARPA. And so there is a weaponised dimension to this technology. It could be used on human populations in negative ways. So that's another sleeping dog issue.
Fine, because I want to be able to talk to you about how it could be used as a weapon with humanity.
Very quick summary. A gene drive is the insertion of genetic material in an organism that may cause it to become sterile. Now, the reason it's being done in New Zealand, a lot of the research is that there's a hope that they may be able to sterilise some difficult introduced noxious animals. How might it be used in a war situation? Well, gene editing works on plants as well as animals, and humans too, and it could be used to ruin the crop system of a hostile state, for instance, because if you get the right genetic construct into their key crops and then fly over with a plane and make sure that the pollen that enters the crop through normal pollination processes, you've got a country facing starvation.
Frightful. Bob, you've got an insight to this too. Could you say what you feel is extremely appropriate for a New Zealand audience?
Well, I just refer historically. Graham Searle's book that Dennis mentioned at the beginning here was called Rush to Destruction. And I think that theme continues today, certainly with the nuclear industry. And I'll give a sort of a longer historic view of how I see things. After the Big Bang, the radioactivity level on the surface of the Earth was very high, and it took billions of years for the decay of that material to get to a low enough level for the molecule DNA to survive. The DNA molecule is a large molecule, which is why humans are so susceptible to radioactive fallout and exposure to radioactivity, because the intense energy of radioactive isotopes will destroy both strands of the DNA. Now, we have evolved mechanisms in our body to do DNA repair, but mostly the repair can only take place on the single strand. The double strand damage of DNA produces a mutation, which often produces a cancer or just loss of function. And what the nuclear industry, in my view, is doing is returning to the surface of the Earth the powerful anti-life isotopes that took us billions of years to be able to survive after they had decayed. And they're doing that in rather cunning ways by promoting it as a clean green energy, which it's not. And they're also promoting it as a cleaner way to disinfest pests and to give fruit and vegetables a longer shelf life, and that's food irradiation. So I think the two things are connected. And also the irradiation industry, if it gets established to the extent that it wants to, they will have to be using radioactive cesium as a source of their gamma rays, and that is radioactive cesium-137 is produced in reprocessing plants that are separating plutonium, which is pretty much only used for very high-yield nuclear weapons. We don't want to be part of that chain.
I'm in full agreement. I know that in Caboolture, in Queensland, just north of Brisbane, they've got this large production plant that's putting on all this Australian food before it comes to New Zealand. And yet New Zealanders don't even know that this irradiation plant actually exists. Mm. So we've got some major issues facing us. And where do you think the best action needs to take place?
No, golly. Where do we... Well, the best action, where does it need to take place? In the consciousness and the sentiments of the 5 million odd people who are living here, as well as the rest of the people in the world. That's where the thing has to start. And it has made hesitant starts, and it has also had knockbacks, that the growth of what we might call a social and ecological consciousness that will enable us to survive. And we're running into a generational problem that Bob hinted at already, in that those of us who've now been involved in these issues for maybe up to 50 years are finding the younger generation are picking up quite well on what's immediately around them, and there are many who are wonderfully idealistic, and they picked up on some very important issues, particularly, I guess, climate change. But they haven't realised that many of the issues like nuclear power and various forms of threats to wilderness lands and wilderness environments, etc., that they kind of believe were solved, are still ongoing problems. Maybe not so much in New Zealand right now, but certainly in countries with which we have very close economic relations and who can influence us to take bad steps in policy about these issues. So, for instance, I'm involved right now in trying to help prevent the damming of a extraordinarily beautiful river in southwestland, the Waitaha River. It's a river that's not particularly big. Most people have not even heard of it, but it is an extraordinary river running through mainly Department of Conservation land, steep gorges from classic alpine country. It is a classic, this river. And apart from canoeing societies, very few New Zealanders know that this river is there. Now, Westpow, a small corporation dealing out electricity in Westland, decide they have expansionist aims and they want to put a run-of-the-river hydro scheme on this river. Not a very big one, only 25 megawatts, but it's enough to ruin the best part of the river. And so you go in there and you do all the obvious things. You say, is this electricity needed? Now, we are in favour of some forms of hydro development. We're not against hydro development. We say, but is the electricity needed? And is the design of the scheme a wise design? And why are you doing it anyway? Because it's on conservation land. Well, the answers to those are the electricity is not needed. There are already 400 megawatts of consented electricity schemes yet to be built that are not too bad ecologically. They have some sustainable quality to them. So we don't need this little scheme that's going to do so much damage. The electricity is not needed. Westland has a surfeit of electricity. They're not using the electricity they're getting. And what about the conservation land? The answer to that is that they have already got a conditional consent to build this project on conservation land, and that provisional consent was given by the Minister of Conservation in the last government, Maggie Barry, who in effect contravened the legislation that she is meant to be enforcing, the 1987 Conservation Act. Now, to get that issue around to people, and here I'm not only talking about younger people, but all age groups, it's a major problem. It's not a big story. It's not even particularly sexy.
Yeah.
You know, it's harder now to get stuff like this around. Politicians are less liable to communicate back to you if you write to them. Submitting organisations that call for submissions, like the Department of Conservation on this particular issue, their Hokitika office, I have to be on the phone time and time again saying, why haven't you acknowledged our submission? When are you going to give us a date on your hearings and decisions? It was actually easier in this way 40 years ago. There was more dialogue between officials, politicians and environmentalists 40 years ago than there is now. You have to really struggle to get direct contact now, even with Green Party people. I waited a year for a letter on an important transport issue from a Green Party spokesman on transport. So this is a situation that is getting more like the kind of politics that you get in America, where the officials and politicians say, don't ring us, we'll ring you, and they don't ring.
Yeah, well, what story is I'm finding across the board is that the powers that be are always forcing us to complete submissions. I'm doing submission after submission, and this is their game. We have to get above this particular game, because no matter where it is, on all the different issues, you have to do a submission. Well, if we were paid to do a submission out of that corporation's funds, it would make it better for us. But they've got the funds, and they expect all the people who are poor or who care to go out of their way. We're all time-starved. We're all in need of a rest. But submission after submission, and I hear you so clearly, how do we find a way round this? Because they're just running us down. They're just tiring us out. It's a big, big challenge for us.
Well, Bob might have more to say to this, about this than me because of more direct experience, but one simple example is the way the court system works, where it's almost impossible to take the risk of bringing a major issue into a New Zealand court to enforce even our own legislation. Now, for instance, the anti-nuclear legislation, we wanted to bring a case into the courts about that because we thought there was a strong chance that the concentrated uranium shipments were in breach of our legislation. I'll let Bob complete the story.
Yes, we got a good pro bono assistance from an experienced barrister on this, and we were advised that it was likely to be extremely costly and the chances of getting any sort of favourable resolution were quite slight. So we had to evaluate. In terms of priorities, we didn't have the resources to proceed with that. But in other instances, we have gone to the Environment Court on appeals, and probably the most successful one from our point of view and from the marine mammal point of view was when we challenged Ports of Auckland, who sought to use underwater explosives to deepen the Rangitato Channel into Auckland. And there were 7 appellants to that, and by the time it got to the Environment Court, the other 6 had settled with what they call confidential settlements, and we were not able to get any figures on how much money was paid out to silence them. In this instance, we had pro bono help from an environmental barrister, which was brilliant, and we stuck to our guns, and perhaps it's the wrong term to use, but the underwater explosions, they were using 100 kilograms of gelignite per blast. It's a lot. And there's over 20 species of marine mammals visit the Hauraki Gulf in their migrations. Some are resident there. And we proposed a methodology that would not require the use of explosives on the basis that Ports of Auckland would agree to follow this methodology right to the beginning. At the first stage of the dredging, we agreed to withdraw our appeal, and our proposal was entirely successful and no explosives were used. The job was done much faster. Had they gone ahead with the consultants' proposals, they would have been drilling and blasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for up to 6 months, which is a major underwater assault on marine mammals. And in fact, the job was done by a local firm with a barge-mounted excavator and a lot of ingenuity in a much shorter period. We should have got a big check out of that one, but we didn't.
Yeah, well, this is excellent to hear that Kiwi ingenuity and a focus on the issue, and we found a way to resolve it. Well done. I'm speaking with Dennis Trussell and Bob Tait of the New Zealand chapter of Friends of the Earth, and they are based here in Auckland.
Well, it's not as easy now. When we did that appeal, I think it was $50 to lodge the appeal. Under the last government, the changes to the RMA, it's punitive. They want $500. I described it as like you used to be able to walk to the Environment Court and start the process. Now you've got to hail a taxi, and the flag fall is $500, and that opens the taxi door, lets you get in the taxi. And then the driver says to you, and you've got to put up surety for costs, which could be $10,000, $20,000. If you can't do that, they keep the $500 and kick you out of the taxi. You never get to court.
It's stacked always against us.
Yeah.
And who are these interests?
Well, let's just say that in recent years, the lobbyists for businesses, and I don't mean just local ones, but international ones, have been far more successful in influencing government than the lobbying of the environmental protectors. And that's unfortunate, but that's reality.
There's a very good case to be made, for instance, with legal action, that there should be legal aid for people bringing cases in the public interest.
For the global commons,
yeah,
definitely.
For the global commons. And a good judge or magistrate can determine in 5 minutes whether an environmental case being brought is merely vexatious or is important. So it's not going to cost them much to set up a system where important and authentic cases are heard with the help of legal aid, so that the people's voice, so to speak, can be heard in our own court system.
This is really important, what you're saying. I mean, it is the people versus a conglomerate. Well, the people need to have this voice and have financial support.
And we pay for the court system. We pay the salaries of the judges. We pay for the courtrooms through the taxation system. They are our courts, just as the officials who are meant to be safeguarding the environment, employed by organisations like DOC, Ministry for Environment, Land Care, etc., all these big organisations, we already pay for them. They are actually our employees, but they act as if we're asking them a special favour merely to humbly knock on their door.
This is terrible.
There's times when we've resorted to extreme satire, and I recall when, in the earlier days of IRMA, when they were basically rubber stamping every application for introducing a hazardous organism into New Zealand that come before them, that we made up what I called the IRMA insole, and it was in the shape of a foot insole for your shoe, and it was called the IRMA insole and was designed to be put into the appropriate shoe of the decision makers to correct their pronounced leaning towards the applicant. It was suggested that this could be useful in enabling them to stand up straight and say no for once. Well, we never got a reply to that, and next time I was down in Wellington, I went to the IRMA office and sought acknowledgement that they had received it.
Yeah, well, you see, this is a vested interest. Now, I want to come around. There's gags as well, and gags, I think, are one of the most insidious of all legalese, because somebody has been told to shut up. Yeah. They cannot allow this to come out for the good of the whole or the public good, and so they're just told to shut up, or else they'll be either fined and jailed or both.
At first, when you said gags, I thought you meant spoofs, but I will mention a spoof. At the conclusion of the report of the Royal Commission on Genetic Modification, it was headed by Justice Michael Baum, that's right. Yeah, and we were very... Friends of theirs received a grant from the Goldsmith Foundation to bring out Dr. Arpad Pushtai and his team of researchers to give evidence at the Commission. And he got very poor treatment in terms of the receipt of his evidence. And it turned out that briefing papers had been prepared for the commissioners before they'd even heard any words from the witnesses, any evidence. And parts of the briefing paper were rehashed in the Commission's report. And it's almost as if it was what we call repressive tolerance. But to symbolise that, I produced these little bottles of what I called Eichel balm, ointment by royal appointment, a soothing balm to ease transgenic trauma and dislocated DNA. Endorsed by the PM, quote, a little smear goes a long way. Well, our witness was extensively smeared through the media, and it was very disappointing. But you've got to engage with these things.
Yeah, suppression of the facts of the case is a major problem. Now, the way Dr. Pushtai and others of the witnesses were treated by that Royal Commission was appalling. In fact, it would have been slander had it been in an open environment, and systematic falsehoods about their work were perpetrated, and some of them were so bad that we actually had to bring a case under the Broadcasting Standards Act against Radio New Zealand because of a journalist who perpetrated some of those falsehoods about the material presented by our witnesses. And these were distinguished scientists, these guys. They weren't just,
there's a lab in Scotland.
Hippie idealists, so to speak.
Yes.
Now, right now, I'm dealing with a suppression case, right now, on an important issue. I've said I'm writing a submission at the moment on the new wave of genetic technology, a key piece of evidence about the associated problem of dealing with pest control was suppressed when it was done in the 1990s. It was a piece of research that was commissioned by the Department of Conservation, and the subject of the research was to see if dropping 1080 on a site caused insect death. Now, 1080 was actually designed originally as an insecticide, so it wouldn't be surprised if it was killing the insects on the site, right?
Yes.
And the researcher discovered, yes, indeed, it was killing the insects on the site. Some of those insects were crucial in creating and helping break down forest litter and therefore giving the trees nutrients. So he duly reported back to the Department of Conservation, yes, this is the case, and the Department of Conservation immediately suppressed his paper. It's never been published. It's only come out into the open because one of our colleagues managed to get an OIA, official information access to it. He published some of its findings. The scientist, a man called Dr. Mike Meads, was going to present his findings to the Royal Society, an organisation to which I am now making our genetics submission in regard to pest controls. And 10 days before he was going to give his submission to the Royal Society, the Department of Conservation fired him. Now, there's an example of suppression that is still active now, 24 years later, with a particular document, a particular piece of research.
Thank you for this, because we did do a Green Planet FM interview of Clyde Graff in relationship to
the
this.
Graff boys.
Oh, that's right. So greenplanetfm.com, you can see that on the front page. We need to get this information back out into the public arena. We've got to mobilise New Zealanders. Yeah. We cannot take any time off.
Well, to add insult to injury, once again, the public have paid for this information. Their taxes have paid for this research, and it is hidden from them. This is not a democracy if this is happening.
Agreed. So where to from here?
Well, there have been some good steps. The OIA system, the Official Information Act system, was an attempt to lessen suppression, and sometimes it works. But the officials found all sorts of tricks around the legislation so that they would still hold, you'd wait weeks and months for it to get to you. And I hate using the word transparency because it's become a cliche. It's become almost meaningless. New Zealand is officially defined, I think, as being one of the most transparent countries in the world in which to do business, in which to politically lobby and make cases, etc. It's meant to be terribly transparent.
And honest.
And honest. Now, if we're the most honest, I hate to think what the less honest countries are like, because there is a great deal of dishonesty in public life in this country.
Thank you. Yes. So do you get the support? I mean, the Environmental Defence Society, they're full of lawyers and ex-judges and God knows what else. Do they not see this?
Well, they're our colleagues.
Good.
They do good work.
Yes.
Sometimes we disagree with them. They're much better at using the courts than us because they got more resources and more lawyers. And sometimes they use the courts very well. But, of course, they're playing a dangerous game of bringing in interests who are only really prepared to pay lip service to environmental and social issues. They're prepared to hand out a little bit of dosh to an organisation like the Environmental Defence Society, providing that society doesn't
step on their feet,
do too much treading on delicate corns. Bob, you probably had a few more dealings with them than me directly.
Yeah, I have a bit of difficulty with some of their commercial sponsors, and the one that brought that home was climate change conference that they had in Auckland a couple of years ago, and the main sponsor was Shell.
That's right.
Yeah. And people argue that they need to get money from somewhere, but big corporations know the value of greenwashing, of gaining the image that they are moving to renewables and that, when in fact they'll just carry on business as usual. And they'll use the same sort of tactics that the asbestos industry used, that the tobacco industry used, and is still using, I might add. And Friends of the Earth has never accepted commercial sponsorship in that way, because we're a small organisation. We're basically a research-based watchdog group, but our credibility has been maintained because we haven't got tainted with being used as a vehicle for commercial interests and lobbyists. And it's important to maintain that.
We all agree. Yes. So New Zealanders who are listening here realise that these are dedicated people who have been working for a long, long time. I mean, Dennis, his dear wife, worked on the first Rainbow Warrior. She was the chef on this little ship that went out there and confronted the powers that be with drums of nuclear waste and God knows what else. So I'm asking you to step forward if you can, and I'm wanting to, at the end, I'm going to give the address and all the data so that you can contact Friends of the Earth, because, as I said, I was involved with them way back in 1974, and my heart has always been here with them solely because they're dedicated and they live, I'd say, a very frugal existence because they know that our footprint is big enough as it is. And so, can I just ask one question that came to me when I was hearing you talking about the uranium that's coming in on shipments? Did you take a Geiger counter down to the wharf or close to the ship, or were you even allowed on the wharves?
No, we didn't have that
technology.
Well, Tim, as you know, you were instrumental, literally, in getting a very useful Geiger counter from America.
Way back,
which was used by Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. It was used particularly in our joint campaign against the mining of the heavy mineral sands at Barrytown Flats, because when we researched into that, we found that New Zealand was the first country in the world to introduce an Atomic Energy Act, which was brought in amongst the Allies after the war to try and secure the supplies of fissile material. And in New Zealand, they had a search for uranium. The DSIR produced a booklet on it, and they found, examining all the analyses and tailings, that the most available source or concentrated source of uranium in New Zealand was in the tailings from the gold mining at Barrytown Flats.
And Barrytown Flats is?
Barrytown Flats is the west coast below Westport. Company Westland Ilmenite, division of North Broken Hill Pico.
I wondered where they would come in.
Yeah. They set up a front New Zealand company, including the principal partner of Simpson Grierson, who was acting as their lawyer, but he was actually a director as well. And
double dipping?
Well, I wouldn't quite use that term, but he was challenged. And when we looked at in those days you could get reports from the stock exchange on companies, and one of my colleagues got that report, and there was little illustrated ships there travelling across the Tasman containing not just ilmenite but the zircon, which contains most of the radioactivity, and the monazite. And the Geiger counter was quite useful going down there and demonstrating that there was radioactivity in those heavy mineral sands. And the intention was to sell the zircon and the monazite that would go on to be further processed in Australia and France to extract the thorium and the uranium. And at the time, the French were testing in the Pacific, and we said, if we were going to let this stuff go offshore, we might be getting some of it back in the form of fallout.
Yes.
And we pressured through a big, long campaign, and it was a joint campaign, and finally the DSIR, as they were then, did a study into the radioactive minerals, and they said that if they're going to extract that material there, they can't export it because of its strategic value, and they have to return it to the land in the same concentration with which they found it. And that meant they couldn't dig a big pit and pour it all in there.
Yes.
Or they'd have a radioactive hotspot.
So to spread it all out or dilute it.
So they had to mix it back into the soil and the sands. And of course the cost of that operation, it was uneconomic. They got their resource consent, but the conditions of it were such that it wasn't economic, and they moved. The big internationals just go for the cheapest place to mine heavy mineral sands with the least environmental regulations. But having that Geiger counter was a big help. So thanks for that. No, we weren't. No, answer your question. We're not able to go onto the wharves and go down into the holds of the ship and do that. But we did establish that the port had hazardous goods storage areas, which were, in our view, completely inadequately secured. And what's worse, they were on a document that was on the port's website, Ports of Auckland website, and one of them you could get at just with a rowboat. And we persuaded them that this information as to where the hazardous and dangerous goods are stored in central Auckland should not be made available to anybody who has bad motives.
Yes.
And we stopped another ship that was coming into Auckland Harbour with an excessive... They're allowed to bring in certain dangerous goods, but there's limits on things like ammonium nitrate, which is used for most of the big terrorist bombs. I think the big one in in the States. At
Oklahoma. Yeah. The Mara building.
Anyway, that was that's incredibly dangerous stuff, and they were there was going to be a ship coming in with way in excess of the permitted load. The harbour master, once it had been brought to the attention, forbade it to come in, and I remember him telling me that he didn't want to be responsible for taking out Devonport. So in that instance, we were able to get the documentation without actually having to physically inspect it, but it was effective.
Well, I'm glad that we can finish on an effective note as well, because, you've just reminded me of the issues, because there's so many things happening in the world, and we have to really focus on what's happening in our local backyard. And so how would you want people to respond to this program? Now, I've got a Gmail account for you, Dennis. I've also got another email, a faux address as well. I can cover this after the break. What would you like to see happen?
In regard to communicating with us and helping us a little bit with cash, because we function on the smell of an oily rag, basically.
Vegetable oil.
Yeah, vegetable oil, olive oil, actually. We are seeking a few more subscribers to the company, because we function basically by people paying a kind of subscription, often on a monthly or annual basis. They pay a small sum into a bank account that pays our rent and our internet stuff, computer and phone. And a lot of people may donate $20 a month to us or something. Or sometimes they may send us just one big cheque or a bigger cheque. That's the nuts and bolts. That's the financial help that we are forever in need of, because we don't go to sponsors for the reasons already described in the interview. And the other thing, if you want to communicate with us, you can go to the Friends of the Earth email. Do you want me to give that on air?
Quickly, because we're running short.
FOENZ@kcbbs.gen.nz. FOENZ@kcbbs.gen.nz. And the phone number is, the office phone number is 09 360 9149, and the post office box number is Post Office Box 5599, Wellesley Street, Auckland. The office phone number is 09 360 9149, and the post office box number is Post Office Box 5599, Wellesley Street, Auckland.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You are all volunteers too, so the cash is only going for the real important needs.
Yes, we can guarantee it's not being put on the stock market.
Bob Tait, Dennis Trussell, thank you very much for awakening us to the issues of the day.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. It's great.
Decide to network. Use every letter you write, every conversation you have, every meeting you attend, every email you send. And remember, even Facebook. To tweet and to express your fundamental beliefs and dreams. Affirm to others the vision of the world you want. Network through thought. Network through action. Network through love. Network through the spirit. You are the center of a network. You are the center of the world. You are a free, immensely powerful source of life and goodness. Affirm it, spread it, radiate it. Think day and night about it, and you will see a miracle happen. The greatness of your own life in a world of big powers, media and monopolies, but of 7.6 billion individuals, networking is the new freedom, the new democracy, a new transparency, and a new form of wholeness and happiness. This originated by Dr. Robert Muller, Chancellor of the World Peace University in Costa Rica, Central America. I invite you to be able to come to greenplanetfm.com, where we have over 400 interviews in our database, which you can readily download and listen to be able to inspire yourself to become the change you want to see in the world and become involved in caring for your children and grandchildren's future. We are also on Facebook, on Green Planet FM and ourplanet.org. Please come and love us. This is Tim Lynch.
And or Lisa Eyre. And Liz Gunn.
In the spirit of Aroha, wishing you a wonderful week. We look forward to being with you next week. I say, kia kaha and haere ra.